My name is Jack Brown, and I'm an alcoholic. I'm in remission, not recovery, because you never truly recover from this addiction. It's taken me a long time to fully grasp that this is a disease, and trust me, it is an illness. Alcoholism cost me everything. My job, my marriage, and my children before I finally accepted the truth and sought help. The price I paid was far too steep, and if I could, I'd do anything to turn back time and start over with a clean slate. When things started unraveling, I'd been married to Allison for 18 years. We had two amazing kids, Jane, who was 16 at the time, and Alistair, 14. To be honest, I later realized our problems went further back than I initially thought. Allison, my wife, is a beautiful woman. She's 5 feet 6 inches with striking auburn hair. When we first met, she wore it in a ponytail, but after we got married, she cut it short for convenience. Even after having 2 kids, she maintained her stunning figure. We met in school, and from the moment I saw her, I was drawn to her. Allison had a natural elegance. No matter what she wore, it always looked effortlessly chic. When I first asked her out, she turned me down. But I didn't give up. Every couple of weeks, I'd ask her again until finally she said yes. We started dating, though it wasn't exclusive at first. She went out with other guys, and I didn't pry or demand explanations. Maybe that's what intrigued her. I had a few other girlfriends too, and I think she was more jealous than I ever was. She always seemed to find out who I was seeing and exactly how far things had gone. And she was usually right. After leaving sixth form, Allison attended a stage school in London. She had the ambition and talent to be an actress, and that was her goal. Her course was scheduled to last for 3 years, so we parted as friends. It was to be 5 years before our paths crossed again. I, on the other hand, remained in our hometown and started work as a trainee salesman in the service sector. It was mostly boring, but I learned the basics of selling, and after a few years, moved on to work for a major HGV distributor called Packers Goods Vehicles, or PGV for convenience. About this time, I was still living at the home of my Uncle John. My parents died in a major pileup on the motorway when I was 12, and my uncle and aunt took me in and cared for me. They were a childless couple, and I grew to love them both as they loved me. Sadly, my aunt died of cancer when I was 20, and Uncle John started drinking more and more heavily. Fortunately, he had some good friends who helped steer him off the self-destructive path he was on, and he stopped drinking almost overnight. I was good at my job, and soon started to move up the ladder. Selling goods vehicles is hard work. A salesman has to know his customers very well, and coupled with this, he also needs to understand their business. PGV was selected as the launch dealership for a new goods vehicle manufactured by Volvo. My boss offered me the chance to develop the whole sales program, who to target, prepare the launch promotion, and organize the entire event. Most of the planning was pretty easy. Volvo would provide all the promotional material, the trucks, and most of the budget. All I had to do was deliver the sales. The main launch plan I developed was a sort of track day, but instead of fast cars, we would have 2 of the new wagons on static display, and 2 more available for our customers to take out on the track, ungoverned. I proposed to let our customers try them out and give them the chance to have a thrilling time around the circuit. My boss accepted this plan but wanted some models to decorate the static vehicles and tempt the customers to stay on and enjoy the day. Sex sells was his motto. I struggled to find a company that could provide suitable models. Then I remembered Allison. We had kept in touch and even dated occasionally when she was at home visiting her parents. We got on well together, but the trouble was her career was London-based, and she was reluctant to give up her lifestyle. She had attended stage school, and her ambition was to be an actress. She had yet to make the breakthrough, and was still confident that she would. She admitted she was struggling to make a living as an actor, but modeling helped supplement her earnings. I contacted her and explained my problem. She told me to give her a couple of days, and she would get back to me. She did better than that, and was on the phone the next morning with costs, and told me she was emailing me some photographs of models for selection. That afternoon, I had a review meeting with my boss and was able to present him with the complete package and budget projections. He reviewed the presentation and gave me the go-ahead on the spot. The promotion went like clockwork, and the models were a great success with our customers. Models draped over and behind the wheel of these huge articulated lorries kept the clients interested all day. It took a few months, but the orders for the new vehicles soon started to come in. Allison and I spent a lot of time together planning the event, and before long, we became an item. As our feelings deepened and passions mounted, I discovered she was an adventurous lover. And I guess it was the actress in her. She loved it where there was an element of risk attached. We had some memorable moments, but eventually we settled into a committed relationship. 2 years later, we got married. We set up house together in our hometown, but she continued to work and had some success in TV commercials. Things were starting to look up for her when she got cast in a daytime TV soap as a character that provided the other actors a foil to work against. Then she got pregnant with Jane. She was at a loss to understand how it happened since she was on the pill, but the doctor told her that even the pill wasn't 100% foolproof. Allison was worried that the soap producers would cancel her contract, but to her surprise, they wrote her pregnancy into the storyline. Her part suddenly started to grow, as did her belly. They even wanted to record the baby's birth, but I stopped that in its infancy. I think Allison was disappointed with me but didn't push it. After Jane was born, Allison scaled back on her career. She committed herself to being a full-time wife and mother. We settled into a life of domestic harmony that lasted for the next 4 or 5 years. During this time, Alistair was born. We were now the complete family. Allison was a good mother, and her love for our babies shone through. She was the one who got up in the middle of the night when they were little. Well, most of the time anyway. She would spend hours with them, teaching them to pronounce words and reading stories to them from the dozens of children's books we had. When our youngest Alistair started at school, Allison approached me and told me that she wanted to return to work. We discussed the ramifications. My concerns were that our family life would suffer. Actors work odd hours and could be away from home for long periods. Allison assured me she would only consider roles that she could fit into her schedule without overnight assignments. We agreed to give it a try, and she contacted her agent. He was delighted, and she soon had auditions to attend. She picked up some work doing voiceovers for commercials. True to her word, during those first couple of years, Allison was always there for us, and we were a happy, close-knit family. Our intimate life was about as good as it gets. We rarely had any arguments. However, the first signs of change came about 8 years ago. Allison accepted a role in a new play. The issue was that the theater was in London, meaning long days during rehearsals, and she often returned well after 7 in the evening. Once the play opened, to great success, she was absent from our lives until midnight most nights. The travel was just too much, so she made arrangements to stay overnight at the flat of a fellow actress. What began as once or twice a week soon turned into 3 or 4 nights away. The strain was telling on our marriage. Our intimacy was nearly non-existent, and even though we traveled up to London every other weekend to see her, Allison became increasingly distant. Meanwhile, I had 2 young children to care for in addition to my demanding job. Her mother was a godsend, coming over every day with a prepared meal and being there when the kids returned from school. I drifted into the habit of having a couple of drinks every night. The kids weren't alone in missing Allison. The event that triggered my suspicions that maybe she was being unfaithful was the award season. They are traditionally held in early January each year, and this year was no exception. You know the kind of thing when the TV, film, and theater crowd get together to pat themselves on the back. Allison was nominated for an award as supporting actress, and she phoned and asked me to accompany her to the dinner and ceremony. I thought this was a great chance to try and mend bridges, so I arranged for her mother to babysit and joined Allison at her shared flat. I showered and changed into my tuxedo, and then waited until Allison was dressed to join me. She looked absolutely fabulous. I complimented her on her gown, and she hugged me, but when I tried to kiss her, she rebuffed me, saying, "I've spent ages on my makeup. Please don't spoil it for me." At the dinner, I was introduced to Michael Adams, the play director, and some of the cast. Also at the table was Marcus Ward, the producer, and a couple of others. Marcus was a big man, around 6 feet tall and around 55 years old. I would have guessed, but he was running to fat now and looked even older. The dinner and the awards went on, but finally it was over. Allison duly won her award and thanked everyone for their help and support throughout her career. I guess I was the only one to notice that she made no mention of me or our children, who probably made the biggest sacrifice of all, and that hurt. She rejoined me at our table and accepted the kisses and hugs from everyone seated at the table or nearby. No restrictions on kissing now. She was pretty enthusiastic, all thoughts about disturbing her makeup long forgotten. I felt as though I was being deliberately ignored, so I helped myself to the abundant bottles of wine on the table. Eventually, it was time to leave. I was impatient to get back to the flat and keen to strip that gown off her. I wanted her so badly, but Allison insisted we had to attend a party that the producers of the play were hosting. So I hid my disappointment and reluctantly tagged along. The alcohol was flowing at the party, and I was introduced to so many people that I lost track of the time. I was drinking steadily and needed to relieve myself, so I found the toilet. Unfortunately, there was a queue, and as I stood there behind two striking young ladies, I overheard them talking about Allison. One said, "Of course, I heard that she only got the part because she was prepared to spread her legs for Marcus Ward and his backers." The other woman giggled and said, "Well, good luck to her. My friend went out with him and told me he liked rough treatment. She said she could hardly walk or sit down for days afterward, so she'll earn every role she gets." Here's another bit of gossip I overheard. I have a contact in the theater who told me that he keeps her at his beck and call, and she can never get a day off to see her kids. He insists that she be available whenever the mood takes him. It's her husband I feel sorry for. He's at home looking after the kids while she cheats around on him. I was struck dumb. They must be mistaken. My Allison would never cheat on me, but as I struggled to digest what I had heard, a little voice in the back of my head kept whispering that what I had overheard would account for some of our problems. I tried to dismiss it, but it remained a persistent irritation every time I looked at her. I escaped from the queue, went outside for some fresh air, and peed in the bushes, trying to decide what to do with the information I had overheard. I was more composed when I returned to the party and went to find Allison. I soon found her at the center of a group of men, including Marcus and the 4 other co-producers. She informed me that these were some of the backers of the play. I tried to keep myself under control. If just some of the backers turned out to be 4 men, how many more were there, and how many did she have to win over to get the role? The conversation was a little stilted, and Marcus Ward, in particular, seemed ill at ease in my presence. I wondered if he had a guilty conscience. I was tempted to confront her there and then, but I had no proof. And after all, the gossips could be wrong. I decided to maintain my silence, and Allison asked me to get her another drink. That gave me an excuse to leave their company. I thought I saw a look of relief on the producers' faces as I left them. I got another drink for Allison, and after I handed it to her, I gave her a quick signal that I wanted to leave soon, but she shook her head and turned her back on me to continue her discussion with her admirers. I felt left out and abandoned once more, so I sought solace at the bar. In short, I drank myself into oblivion before nodding off in an armchair. It must have been an hour or so later that I was jerked out of my sleep by a kick to my shins. Allison was ready to leave and clearly disgusted with me. I was still too drunk to care. The next morning, things were icy. No, that's wrong. They were Arctic. I tried to apologize for my behavior the previous evening, but she called me a drunk and accused me of ruining her big night, plus a lot of other things besides. none of them complimentary. I wanted to talk about our marriage, but clearly that wasn't going to happen that day. She stormed out of the flat and said she would talk to me when she returned. She never said where she was going. Sometime later, I got a call from her mother telling me that Alistair was sick. She thought it was appendicitis, and she was so worried. She had asked the doctor to call. I told her that I would catch the next train home and packed my overnight gear. Before I left, I tried to call Allison on her mobile, but it went straight to voicemail. So I wrote her a short note explaining briefly my reason for my early departure. I never expanded on what the problem was with Alistair, just that he was unwell. Let her do something for herself, I thought, if she really cared for us anymore. When I got back 2 hours later, Alistair was in the city hospital undergoing an appendectomy. Allison's parents were there, as was Jane. We greeted each other with hugs, and my mother-in-law told me he had just gone into surgery. The surgeon had told them that the prognosis was good. Alistair was young and fit, and there was no reason for undue concern. Allison's parents asked where Allison was, and I said simply, I have no idea. I tried to call her several times from the train and had to leave messages each time. Her mother got out her phone and tried to call her daughter, with the same result. After what seemed like ages, the surgeon came out and told us the operation went perfectly and that we would be able to see Alistair in an hour or so when he had recovered from the anesthetic. A couple of hours later, we were all sitting around his bed chatting when Allison stormed into the ward, looking like she was ready to slay anyone who impeded her. She wasted no time berating me for not telling her that her son was ill and would not listen to any response. Her father grabbed her arm and pulled her roughly out of the ward, telling her to get herself under control. I moved to follow them, but her mother stepped in front of me and said, "Best leave it to her father, son. You are like a son to both of us. And maybe a few home truths from her dad will be more effective this time." I could see the sense in that and turned back to reassure Alistair and Jane that their mother was just strung out with the pressures of her work. 10 minutes later, a contrite Allison came in and apologized to everyone for her behavior. Her concern for Alistair had gotten the better of her. She hugged Alistair, and after finding out that he was getting better, proceeded to regale everyone about her triumph at the award ceremony. Visiting time was over in a blink, and we departed. When we reached the foyer, there stood Marcus Ward, obviously waiting for Allison. I said nothing and brushed past him. I guess I now had the truth of the rumor. I waited in the car with Jane, while Allison stood talking animatedly with Marcus. I watched as she turned to leave him, but he pulled her around, and they kissed goodbye. Not that unusual, but she kissed him on the lips. Allison joined us in the car and acted as if there was nothing untoward about what we had just witnessed. Jane was clearly upset and challenged her mother about the kiss. "What's with you and him?" "That was more than a thank you kiss," she said, pointing at Marcus. "Are you and Dad getting a divorce or separating?" Good question, I thought, as the same one was on my lips as well. I had heard the rumors. Jane couldn't have any knowledge of the rumors, so her question was very perceptive. Allison replied, "Of course not. I was thanking Marcus for bringing me all the way from London today." "When are you returning to your job?" I asked, because I think Alistair needs you here at this time. "I'll stop over tonight and return tomorrow afternoon in time for the evening performance. He's out of danger now, and I'm sure you and Mom can cope until he gets out of the hospital. I'll arrange to take time off during his convalescence," she replied. I was really frustrated with her reply and let my anger get the better of me. "You're something else, you know that," I exploded. "Our son is still in the hospital, and all you can think about is getting back to your stupid career. Maybe, just maybe, you will want to reflect on that decision, because if you don't, there will be consequences that neither you nor I can control or foresee." We arrived home, and it was a tight-lipped Allison that went upstairs to our bedroom and did not reappear that night. At one point, I took her up some sandwiches and coffee. I knocked on the door, and she opened it and took the tray from me without comment. She had her phone to her ear as she took the tray and closed the door in my face. I slept in Alistair's bed that night, and for the next few nights as well. In the morning over breakfast, Allison informed Jane and me that she had reconsidered and decided to take a sabbatical from the play until Alistair was fully recovered. She also made it very clear that she was doing this under duress, and that I was the one being held responsible. Over the next few weeks, Allison tried very hard to make things right between our children and her. I never went back to our bedroom, and never tried to get intimate with her. Within 3 weeks, Alistair was back to normal, and Allison informed us that she was going back to her role on stage in London the following week. She did make a few concessions and promised that she would be home every other night, and for the first 2 weeks she was. The first time she failed to turn up, I phoned, worried that something had happened as she had not contacted us. It was well after 1 in the morning, and she was normally back by around 12. Her phone was answered by Marcus Ward. He explained that Allison was in the shower and would ring me back, which she duly did. I immediately asked why she was still in London, and she came up with some excuse about feeling too tired to come home tonight. I asked her rather pointedly, "Why is he there?" She must have heard the anger in my voice as she tried to placate me by promising to be home tomorrow. I had had enough and said, "I notice you failed to answer my question, so I'll ask you once more. Why is Marcus in your room at this time of night? Does that make my question clear enough, or do I need to spell it out to you?" She replied, "He was just leaving. I'll talk to you tomorrow." Then she hung up. I started on the whiskey, and when that was finished, the vodka washed it down nicely. She failed to come home the following night, and I called her once more, and was forced to leave a message telling her not to bother coming home, unless it was for good. I started hitting the bottle heavily. In hindsight, it was clear that I was simply running away from confronting the problems with my marriage. It was easier to drown my problems than face up to them. My marriage may well be over soon. This habit grew, and I was drinking a bottle of spirits every night after the kids had gone to bed. It didn't matter what it was: gin, whiskey, rum, you name it, I drank it. Allison eventually returned home one night after the show and found me passed out in the chair. The empty bottle was still clutched to my chest. She went ballistic and accused me of being totally irresponsible. What if something had happened, like a fire or something? I was still half drunk as I mumbled something in response to the effect that if she was at home more often, the situation would not have arisen. All hell broke loose after that. She was livid and went to bed. The following day was a Saturday, so no work for me at least. Allison spent some time with the kids before having to leave for London. She didn't say a word to me before she left. I tried to make amends by calling her repeatedly on her phone, but never got any response. She failed to come home the following week, even on her day off. She did phone the kids on their mobiles every day, but made no effort to contact me. I started drinking more. 1 bottle was not enough to dull my loneliness. Apart from the kids and me, her mother naturally was the one to notice her absence and forced me to sit down and face the issue. I told her about our troubles, and she told me she would try and talk some sense into her daughter. Allison came home the next night, and we had a long heart-to-heart at last. I don't know what her mother said to her, but she was in a far more conciliatory mood. She accepted that her present job was the root cause of our problems, and told me that she had decided to quit. She would have to give them 2 weeks' notice, and that she would email them that night. I challenged her about her relationship with Marcus Ward, and she assured me that she had not had an affair with him or anyone else. She was very convincing. After all, she was an actress, and in any case, I wanted desperately to believe her. I decided to let sleeping dogs lie. She also got her digs in about my excessive drinking, and I promised to curtail it, which I did, even though I refused to admit even to myself that I was overdoing it. The makeup love was fantastic, and the only thing I did notice was that she started to talk differently to me while we were intimate. It was strange. While we always talked during our time together before, the difference was that now she was describing her fantasies to me and encouraging me to do the same. I asked her where this new twist came from, and she told me that her flatmate and she had nothing much to do during the day, so they got into discussing their deepest hidden fantasies with each other. She asked me if I found this change to our life together disturbing, and I told her that as long as they remained fantasies, I had no issue with it. From then on, we introduced more and more wild themes into our private life. The next few years were more settled, and Allison picked up enough work locally to keep her busy. Pressure at my work was getting steadily more onerous. The trade was going through a hard spell, the recession was looming, and one of the first effects was that companies held on to their fleets longer. This, coupled with the high fuel costs, meant that our customers were holding back on reinvesting, so trying to sell in that market was stressful. My boss was not really interested in excuses. It was my job to sell products, and I was told in no uncertain terms that if I couldn't cut it, he would get someone who could. Once more, my drinking took control of my life. I used the excuse that it was due to the pressure at work. In an effort to close a deal with one of my customers, I took him out to a nice restaurant and entertained him, perhaps too well. We were both as inebriated as could be, and at the stage where the inappropriate jokes were being told, I had just suggested that we move on to a local entertainment club. We were both very drunk, and unfortunately, unknown to either of us, his wife had employed a private investigator as she was looking for evidence to support her bargaining position in their upcoming divorce. She got all she needed that night, complete with photographs. She also sent copies to my employer and wife. The following morning, the customer called my boss and told him that we had lost his business and why. My boss called me into his office and fired me on the spot. Allison was livid that I had actually gone to such a club. When she saw the photographs of me with a woman inappropriately close, she went ballistic once more. The feeble excuse that it was just business cut no ice with her. Needless to say, things were pretty frigid around the house for the next month. Unemployed and unemployable. At first, I thought that with my track record, I would have little problem getting another job in sales. Opportunities were few, and to even get an interview was tough. I had a couple of really good interviews, and thought I had a good chance of securing the job. But each time I got knocked back. The word had gone around about my drinking, and my self-confidence suffered. I got into the habit of having a few wind-down drinks each night. Allison still wasn't very responsive to me, so my few drinks soon became more, much more, and I was left to sleep on the couch more often than not. Allison gave up trying to stop me from drinking. I wouldn't have paid any attention anyway. Our marriage was heading only one way, and I was too out of touch to realize it. The children were in their mid-teens when Allison was offered a role in a new late-night drama series, or adult soap opera. This soap differed from the usual day or early evening format, as it was to be broadcast after the water shower of 9 o'clock in the evening. This enabled the writers of the storyline to embrace far more mature themes. Allison's role was to be the provocative temptress, the one who flirts with other women's husbands, dresses daringly, and exudes appeal. Allison played that kind of part extremely well. After all, it almost came naturally to her. All through our marriage, Allison had played up to all our male friends. The doubts I had about her fidelity resurfaced when I discovered that the series was to be produced by none other than Marcus Ward. The first series was to consist of 13-hour-long episodes, and filming was to be in the production company's Manchester studios, with external scenes shot mostly in the Liverpool area. Allison accepted the part. There was no discussion. She simply announced that she had accepted the role. This meant that once again she would be unable to return home each evening, and she would rent a flat during the shooting. The filming was scheduled to last 5 months. Since she was the sole breadwinner in the family, I could hardly object. By this stage, I was only sober first thing in the morning, and by lunchtime, I needed a pick-me-up to help me through the day. I was not drunk. I had learned to hold my liquor by this stage. But by evening, if not plastered, I was well-oiled. I guess Allison was getting desperate about my drinking, and she worried about leaving the children in my care, or so she told me. In an effort to get me to stop, she contacted my Uncle John, and he came over and tried to get me to see just what I was doing to myself and my marriage. I refused to accept that I had a problem and continued as before. Allison simply washed her hands and gave up. She made arrangements with her mother to once again do the honors and keep an eye on our children. She clearly didn't trust me to do that either. That hurt. Once Allison had moved temporarily to Manchester, I realized that things were getting desperate and made an effort to reconnect with my kids. I thought I was doing quite well. I had cut down on my drinking and tried to re-establish relations with Allison, but she was reluctant to discuss our problems on the phone. One day after she had been absent for about 2 weeks, I went up to the studio in Manchester to try and patch things up. At first, I had problems even getting in the door. Security was tight, and I had to get one of the assistant floor managers, or some such, to vouch for me before I was allowed on set. I was warned not to interrupt once the red light was on as they were going for a take. They were shooting a romantic scene, as the assistant informed me, so I stood at the back and observed. Allison had told me that the new show was going to be targeted at adults, but I didn't realize that she would be undressed in some of the scenes. I watched as she and some guy, I later found out he was called Paul, performed a deep, passionate kiss and slowly sank onto the sofa on the set. The man she was kissing only had a pair of boxer shorts on, and Allison had a silk robe loosely tied at the waist. She slowly shrugged her shoulders, and the robe dropped to the floor. Obviously, the editor was going to be busy tidying this scene up. There was no way that scene could be broadcast on a public network in the UK. If she was just acting aroused, she was a better actress than I gave her credit for. The scene came to an abrupt end when Paul couldn't hold it anymore and accidentally ruined the take. The director, Julian, called it a wrap, and everybody burst out laughing, much to Paul's embarrassment. They tried again, and this time, they got it right. Julian had to call cut again before the pair slowly drew apart and smiled into each other's eyes. A blind man could see the look between them as he pulled her to her feet. She bent down and gathered her robe, and ever so slowly pulled it back on. The director called lunch at that point, and Allison walked over to Julian, seeking reassurance that the scene wasn't too graphic. Julian kissed her, and taking her hand, they strolled toward the dressing rooms together. I watched as they disappeared into the same room. I quickly crossed over, and without knocking, barged right in. I saw them in the act of passion. She looked up to see who had disturbed them, and when she realized it was me, she tried to push him away, but he had his hands gripping her and was not ready to surrender. She hissed at him to get off, and he reluctantly let her go. When he saw me, his face turned pale, and he looked for a way to escape, except there was none apart from going through me. As he stood up, I thumped him once high on his cheek and again more accurately on his jaw. That was all it took. He went down and stayed down. Allison had taken the opportunity to pull her robe back on and just sat there, waiting for me to say something. When I refused to react as she expected, she said simply, "I want a divorce. I'm not going to remain married to a drunk. Just so you know, he is not the only one who has been benefiting from your failure to perform lately, but he is the best one so far." So there you have it. I had lost, first my job, now my wife. In the weeks that followed, I was served with the divorce papers. I was drunk most of the time, and stupidly signed anything put in front of me. I found out later that because I neglected to get, I even lost visitation rights to my children, as her lawyer successfully argued I was an alcoholic and not a fit person to be in charge of their welfare for even a short time. I tried to phone them, but she had changed the numbers or something. I was depressed, so I drank, and the more I drank, the more depressed I became. My final indignity, this happened some weeks later, was to find myself on the street with the down and outs. We were sharing a bottle someone had acquired when a crowd of young lads started in on us, and in our drunken condition, We were in no state to defend ourselves. My abiding memory is lying in a gutter, bleeding from several cuts, and being humiliated by the youths. Drunk I may have been, but not so drunk that I didn't recognize my own son standing to one side, watching as his father lay there. Eventually, the police and ambulance came, and I was taken to the hospital. I was kept there for a few days to allow my injuries to heal. The first morning after I was admitted brought my Uncle John, and I was subjected to more than a piece of his mind. He tore a strip off me, and when he was finished and started to leave, I called out, "Please, Uncle, I need help. I know that I spurned your warnings in the past, but I finally realized that I have major problems, and I am begging you to help me." He paused and looked at me reflectively, as if trying to decide if I was worth the effort. Thank God he did, and proceeded to tell me what I needed to do. He told me that it was a hard road that I was embarking on, but promised me support would be there when I needed it. His final words to me that morning were, "In the final analysis, it is all down to you. You have to want to get your life back on track, more than you want to find the solution at the bottom of a bottle." I won't bore you with the details. Suffice it to say, he was spot on. It was hard, far harder than I had thought it would be. But with the continuing support of friends and others, I have managed to stay away from alcohol for 15 months now. As I said at the beginning, I am in remission, not recovering. I am still tempted every time I see people laughing and drinking, but so far I have resisted the temptation. I know what the consequences would be if I succumbed to my weakness. When I was fit enough to be released from the clinic, Uncle John allowed me to return to my old flat in the basement of his property. His home was a ground-floor flat in a Victorian villa. Once a proper family home on 3 floors, it had been converted into 3 separate flats years ago. My aunt and uncle had originally just purchased the ground-floor flat, but when the opportunity came along, they'd purchased the basement flat as well when it came on the market. I was in my teens around then, and he and my aunt decided to buy it with the intention that I would have an independent flat when I left school and started to make my way in the world. I had lived in it as a young man up until I married Allison, and now I had returned to my first home once more. Allison, by this time, had remarried, and her new husband was Julian, the same guy she was with when we split up. He was now fully ensconced in my old home, the same one I had paid the mortgage on for most of my married life. But what the hell? It was time to move on. I tried to rebuild my relationship with my kids, but I was warned off after my first attempt to make contact with them. Allison's lawyer contacted me and reminded me that the restraining order preventing me from contacting them was still in force. This upset me greatly. It wasn't as if I had forgotten their birthdays or anything like that. I still sent them both cards with the 50-pound notes inside, but they never even wrote back to thank me. I checked with a lawyer, and he confirmed that since I had signed the divorce paperwork and everything, I had, in effect, agreed not to have any further contact with my family. He would try to petition to get the restraining order lifted, but he felt that I had not been dry long enough to satisfy the court that I had changed my ways. Uncle John had also provided me with a job working with him at his taxi courier company. I manned the phones to start with, and also helped with the logistics of running a taxi fleet. One day, a few months after I started working for him, he was a driver short for a wedding job, and he asked me to drive one of the cars. I was more than happy to. Luckily, my driving license was still intact. God knows how. I have never even had to face the dreaded breathalyzer, and I had certainly been well over the legal limit on many occasions during my previous employment. After that, he started using me to cover peak hours or sickness absences, and I got to enjoy it. Saturday nights were one of my favorite nights. Watching how people behave when they have had a few too many was enough to reinforce my new teetotal lifestyle. I had been dry for about 12 months when Uncle John sadly passed away one night in his sleep. His funeral was attended by so many people that the crematorium was not large enough to hold them all. I was his only living relative, and he left everything to me. Suddenly, I was in full charge of a business and responsible for the livelihood of around 30 staff. I took my time, and kept the business running more or less in the same fashion as before. I had some ideas about how to make the operation more efficient, but hesitated to change what was a successful business. Some months before he passed on, Uncle John had employed a divorced woman who had a young child to support. Her name was Sally Dean, and she was employed to look after the payroll and accounts. She was very good at her job, so good that I was able to devote more time to developing new business. Her son, Brian, was 10 years old, and he often came in after school to catch a lift home. Sally and Brian lived in a rented flat about 5 miles away from the office. After my uncle's death, I came to rely on Sally more and more. She was an attractive single mother, and apart from her son, I knew little about her. Over those first few weeks, I came to value her good humor and ability to handle the drivers, who constantly tried to get into her favor. I came to work one morning to find Sally very down, not her usual perky self. I watched as she snapped at a couple of the drivers who were flirting with her. Normally, Sally would give as good as she got, and I knew the guys respected her and liked her. I waited for things to settle down and went into her office, closing the door behind me. I asked her what was wrong, and she burst into tears. Her landlord was evicting her for allegedly allowing her home to be used for inappropriate activities, and she was behind with the rent. She swore that this was totally untrue, and the true reason was that she refused to have a relationship with him. I thought about it for a moment and had a possible solution. I told her about the flat, and that it was fully furnished. All she would need were her family's personal possessions, and it was vacant. I also had to tell her that the staircase leading from the basement to the ground floor had been reinstated when I had lived there before, but that she could lock the door and her privacy was assured. She asked about the rent, and I told her a figure that I knew she could afford. It was less than she was paying now. She accepted my offer, sight unseen, and I made arrangements to have a van and driver available for her at the weekend to move her stuff. I intended to be the driver. I wanted a word with her present landlord. We had her moved into the flat in a matter of hours, and mother and son were delighted with their new home. I handed the key to the door leading to my flat above to her, and she handed it straight back. She told me that the door was always open to me, and then burst into tears again. Both Brian and I tried to comfort her, but she just shook us off and went into the kitchen to put the kettle on. She insisted that I come down to dinner with them both that evening as a thank you for my kindness. I was touched and accepted her offer. Over dinner, I noticed that she had only soft drinks on the table and decided not to mention it until Brian was in bed. It was later that same night that I broached the subject and told her that she didn't need to abstain from alcohol just because I was present. She looked at me and then, taking a deep breath, said, "I thought John would have told you." She said, "I was one of his waifs and strays. I am an alcoholic too. And if it wasn't for John, I would have lost my son forever. John was the one who got me to realize that my life was a mess. I was a drunk, homeless, and jobless. Brian had been taken into care, and I was doing whatever it took to put a roof over my head and get the money for drink. There were a lot of men only too willing to let me share their bed in exchange for a few drinks. Brian knows all about my past, and now you do too. It's not something that I'm proud of, but something you two need to know. So now you know about my past and how I lived back then. I suppose you will not be so keen for us to stay in your home." I rushed to reassure her. "Sally, listen. You did what you had to do. I've been there as well. I have done things that I too am not proud of. What's important is that we have come through the bad times. We have a new chance given to us, and it's up to us what we make of it. Now, no more talk about the past. It's gone, and we can't do anything about it. So let's get on with living." Having said all that, I kissed her on the forehead and bade her good night. I purposely avoided her the following day, a Sunday, and so it was Monday when I called to offer her a lift to work. She was worried that if we appeared entering the office together, the guys in the garage would put 2 and 2 together and make 5. I told her I would deal with any comments, and sure enough, just as we got out of the car, one of the lads was stupid enough to make a comment within my hearing. I called them all together and told them in no uncertain terms that any future comments about Sally would be viewed as a disciplinary matter. I also said, for your information, Sally is living with her son in the basement flat in the same building as mine. She doesn't have a car, and as we are both coming to work at the same place, it makes sense to travel together and not leave her at the mercy of public transport. This seemed to clear the air, and the snickers stopped, and normal business was resumed. It's a bit of an occupational hazard, but when two of my drivers were subjected to both verbal and physical assault, action had to be taken. In addition, their cash in hand was also stolen, which was just plain robbery. The problem was always from the same source: our late-night customers, who had over-imbibed and thought the taxi drivers were fair game. The police took the complaint seriously, but even when the drivers were able to identify the culprits, it came down to their word against that of the drivers. Since there were usually 2 or 3 of these guys involved and no other witnesses, the police said we had no chance of getting a conviction. They were very supportive and promised to increase their presence in the city center at the weekends, but felt there was little more they could do. The real issue was that the troublemakers were too smart to try anything in the city center. They waited until the cab was en route to a fake address and then got the driver to pull over. That's where the assaults took place. I decided to do something to protect my staff, so I arranged for small CCTV cameras to be mounted inside the vehicles. I also had prominent stickers placed in the cabs informing customers that they were being taped. I had the cameras linked to the rear doors of my cabs so that when the customers opened the door to get in, the camera started recording. I briefed the drivers on the new security measures and stressed that I was not trying to catch them out, only to ensure their safety. I even told them that I would be taking a cab out the following Friday evening and would work the complete shift with them. True to my word, I worked the shift that Friday evening. I had chosen to drive one of the London black cabs, famous the world over. Just as the pubs were closing around midnight, I was hailed by some youths. They were standing with a girl who was clearly the worse for drink. Her long dark hair was hiding her face, so I was unable to identify her at that point. All 5 got into the cab, and the girl was seated on the rear seat in the middle, sandwiched between 2 of the lads. I had a quick glance to check if she was okay, and noticed that she had long legs encased in leather boots, reaching just below her knees. Her hair was still covering her face. The guy on the jump seat gave me the address, and I started off. I kept glancing in the mirror to see what my passengers were doing. About halfway to the destination, I heard the girl protesting and saw her starting to struggle. I immediately slowed down and ordered them to stop bothering her. They didn't stop, and I saw one of the guys with his hand between her legs. I stopped the cab and turned around when one of them said, "Look, this woman has been teasing us all night. Now she's going to get what's coming. Just take us to our destination, and we'll let you have a chance with her as well." I was getting furious now and looked again to see one of them groping her. All the while, she was crying, begging them to stop. One of the guys pushed her hair away from her face, and I gasped. It was my daughter, Jane. They were assaulting. I couldn't take on all 4 of them, so I thought quickly and resumed driving. I pulled up 2 minutes later outside the local police station. I jumped out of the cab and forced them out. They started to argue, but when one of them realized where they were, they slunk off before they could get into more trouble. Jane was still in the back of the cab, crying softly. I buckled her seatbelt to keep her safe and drove her to what used to be my home. I helped her out of the car and half-carried her to the front door. Judging by the music playing inside, there was a party going on. I banged on the door and the front window to get attention. Finally, the door opened, and standing there in his underpants was Allison's husband, Julian. I pushed past him and headed upstairs toward Jane's bedroom. As I passed the open door to the lounge, I saw several couples in various stages of undress, and a naked Allison quickly pulling on a robe as she rushed to see what was happening. I laid the nearly unconscious Jane on the bed and tried to remove her boots. I glanced around and there was Julian standing at the foot of the bed. I demanded that he leave the room. "You can't order me around in my own home," he blustered. I loudly retorted, "Get out, before I throw you out." Allison arrived at that moment, and one look at her eyes told me she was high on something. She had traces of white powder around her nostrils, and her eyes were glazed over. When she saw the state our daughter was in, her face went pale. The shock of seeing Jane so obviously drunk seemed to sober her up enough to understand what was happening. She quickly pushed Julian out of the room and closed the door. She helped me remove Jane's boots and then pushed me out too. "I'll handle it from here. You've done enough tonight," she said. I waited downstairs, amused as their guests hurriedly gathered their clothes and left, clearly embarrassed. I guess I had ended their party early. Julian was sitting on my old recliner, drinking beer straight from the bottle. Suddenly, he stood up, grabbed a half-full bottle of scotch, and shoved it into my hands, giggling drunkenly. "Have a drink on me." I took the bottle by the neck and shoved it back into his chest. "The next time you try to be funny, I'll put this bottle somewhere very unpleasant and smash it while it's there," I snarled. Fortunately, Allison returned at that moment and told him to sit down and sober up. She turned to me and asked, "You'd better tell me what happened to Jane." But Allison was still in no state to comprehend what had almost happened to our daughter. I ignored her question. "I'll be back tomorrow morning at 11, and we will discuss it then. Jane should be sober enough by then, and I'll explain how she ended up in my cab. I think you should think about why she was out drinking tonight when she's not even 17 yet. Never mind 18. She was supposed to be staying overnight with a friend. Alistair is at his friend's house tonight. That's why we were having a party," Allison replied. I couldn't resist saying, "And we both know what kind of party it was, don't we? Don't you dare judge me and how I live my life," she screamed back. "See you tomorrow," was all I said as I walked out the door. When I got home that night, Sally was waiting up for me. She was in her dressing gown and handed me a cup of coffee as I walked in. I asked her why she was still up, and she said she had heard all about the incident from one of the other drivers. Ours is a close-knit business, and word travels fast, but I was surprised to hear that Sally was part of the grapevine. We sat and talked for some time as I explained what had transpired. We discussed it, and she thought I had handled it well. We were sitting on the couch, so close we were almost touching. I could feel the warmth emanating from her dressing gown, which barely concealed her form. I leaned toward her and kissed her softly on the lips. She wrapped her arms around my neck, pulling me into a tight embrace. The growing attraction I felt for her was clearly mutual. I asked if she was sure she wanted to continue, and she nodded, but said, "I think the bed will be more comfortable than this couch." I took her hand and led her upstairs to my bedroom, where we wasted no time enjoying each other's company. By the time we were done, we were both sweating as if we'd been in a sauna. We kissed some more, but then she practically jumped out of my arms when her son, Brian, casually strolled into the bedroom. "So, this is where you are. I looked everywhere downstairs and couldn't find you," he said, with a touch of reproach in his voice. He then looked at us more closely and asked, "Why aren't you wearing your pages? You always wear them when you sleep in your own bedroom." Sally burst into giggles and told him to go make himself some cereal, promising she'd be down soon. After he left, she jumped up, ran into the bathroom, and had a quick shower. When she emerged, I was still lying in bed. She told me sternly, "Don't think you've gotten away with it this time. You'll have to explain to Brian why I was in your bed and not my own." And she left me to do just that. I cobbled together some explanation, but I could tell it wasn't getting through to him. So, I decided to go with the truth. "Brian, when a man and a woman care about each other a lot, they kiss and cuddle, and sometimes that leads them to share their bed and comfort each other." I was floundering, hopelessly out of my depth. The truth is difficult to explain to a 10-year-old. Brian thought about what I said, then asked the question I dreaded. "Why weren't you or Mummy wearing any clothes?" At that point, Sally, who had been listening to my explanation from the kitchen door, laughing quietly, finally stepped in to save me. She explained, "Sometimes money gets sad and lonely after you go to sleep, and last night, Jack made me feel better." Brian seemed to accept this and wandered off to play with his toys. Sally usually went into the office on Saturday mornings to check the cash and bank it. The drivers were responsible for keeping it safe overnight and dropped it off at the start of their next shift or first thing Saturday morning. I dropped her and Brian off and made my way to my meeting with my wayward daughter and ex-wife. Before I left for my confrontation with my ex-wife and daughter, I asked Sally to download the camera evidence from the previous evening onto a DVD and then edit out all the other excerpts, as I was only interested in one journey. Clutching the DVD, I drove to my old home and arrived right on time for our meeting. Allison opened the door before I had a chance to ring the bell. She was wearing jeans and a t-shirt, and I had a brief thought that she looked poised and elegant, even in jeans. She invited me into the lounge, where I was greeted by Jane and Julian. Sitting there, waiting for me to begin, I considered my next move and abruptly ordered Julian out of the room. He was not happy and started to protest, but I said firmly, "This is a family matter, and as Jane is my daughter, not yours, it's none of your business, so get out, or I'll throw you out." He started to protest again, but Allison whispered to him, and he went, dragging his feet. "Before we discuss what happened to Jane last night, I have a short video you both need to watch," I said. "We can talk after that." I inserted the DVD and switched it on. I hadn't seen the previous night's recording, and as we watched the entire incident, the part where one of the guys made the offer that I could join in caused Allison to shout at our daughter, "How could you let those animals do things like that to you?" Jane burst into tears, unable to answer. I sat beside her, put my arm around her, and talked to her softly. I spoke so quietly that her mother couldn't hear what I was saying, but the words of comfort helped Jane regain her composure. Allison started to harangue Jane again until I told her to stop. I knelt in front of Jane, took her hands, and looked into her tear-filled eyes. "With my history, I am the last one to judge you for what happened last night, but take it from someone who knows. Alcohol can be a good friend to some, but it's a terrible master. It cost me my marriage and my family. I'm not telling you not to drink, because I know that would be pointless, but you have to understand that there are people out there who will take advantage of you. If you're going to drink, make sure you're with people who you trust and who will look out for you." Standing up, I turned to Allison and said, "You have legal custody of our children, and strictly speaking, I shouldn't even be here. The restraining order is still in place, and I could be arrested for violating it. You need to decide what to do about last night, but if you want my advice, talk to Jane about drinking and drugs. Don't preach to her. You're in no position to do that anyway." Before Allison could reply, Jane looked at both of us with a frown and said, "Restraining order? What order? I've never heard of this." I replied, "Before the divorce was settled, your mother was granted an order preventing me from coming anywhere near you or your brother. Don't blame her for it. I was an alcoholic and incapable of taking care of myself at the time, and she was worried I'd do something stupid. That's why I haven't approached you or Alistair since then. But I have kept an eye on you both. I've been to your hockey games, though you never saw me. I made sure of that. Please don't think I don't care about you, because I do. Very much. I've never missed one of your birthdays since I got sober, but since you never responded, I assumed you didn't want me in your life anymore." Turning to Allison, I said, "I want you to petition the court to have the restraining order lifted. I want shared custody and to be a part of their lives again." "Over my dead body," she responded angrily. "You're an alcoholic, and once an alcoholic, always an alcoholic. I'm not letting you anywhere near my children." "Allison," I said tiredly, "people in glass houses really shouldn't throw stones. How do you think the children's panel will react to your current lifestyle? If you don't do what I'm asking, I will be forced to use what I know to apply for full custody of the kids. I was bluffing, but she didn't know that. I have no real information beyond what I saw last night, but are you willing to take that risk? I don't believe you. You've got nothing on me, she cried vehemently. Try me and see if you're that confident, I retorted. But you should also consider how your employers and the public would view your social activities. I turned to Jane and said, sorry you had to hear that, but you're old enough to know what's been going on when you and Alistair were sent to stay with friends. Jane replied, yes, we're both very aware of what's been happening. Julian gives me the creeps. He's always trying to catch me when I'm getting dressed. I've started locking my bedroom door when he's around. Allison turned on her daughter. What do you mean? Are you saying he's made improper advances toward you? Not yet, but I take precautions to make sure I'm never alone in the same room as him. You must have noticed that he looks at me in a way that's wrong. If it weren't for Alistair last week, Julian would have barged in on me while I was in the bath. Alistair caught him trying to open the bathroom door with a screwdriver. Allison screamed, I don't believe you. You're just trying to cause trouble for us. He's done everything to make you like him. And this is how you repay him. By making vile accusations and trying to ruin his reputation. Enough, I ordered, regaining control of the conversation. I turned to Allison and said, you have some serious things to discuss with your husband. And as for you, Jane, I believe you. If he ever does anything inappropriate again, call me immediately. I'm going to have a word with him before I leave. Now, go to your room. I need to talk to your mother and Julian alone. Jane protested, wanting to be present for the discussion, but I overruled her, and she left, surprisingly without much resistance. As she walked out, Julian entered the room. Allison immediately confronted him, accusing him of trying to seduce her daughter. Julian denied it vehemently, and, in a disgusting twist, claimed that Jane was the one teasing him, showing flashes of her underwear. I lost my temper and lunged at him. But he jumped back, and only Allison's intervention stopped me from doing serious damage. She ordered me out of the house, and I reminded her that, legally, I still had a claim to it. She quickly reminded me that I had signed it over as part of the divorce settlement. You tricked me into signing it, I countered. She laughed in my face and simply said, prove it. Prove it indeed. I had no way to do that, but in her present circumstances, I knew that she was vulnerable, so I replied, look, if you fight me over the issue of access to my kids, I will make life very difficult for you. I have plenty of money to drag you and your lifestyle through the courts for as long as it takes. I will also apply for a review of the divorce settlement, claiming that you coerced me to sign the papers after pressuring me with intoxicating liquor. I don't really want the house or the money. I have enough of that thanks to my Uncle John. But if you don't resolve the access issue, it will be a severe court case. I promise you. The tabloids will love it. She pondered for a moment and then said, very well, I will petition to get the restraining order lifted and agree to you seeing the kids as often as they wish. Will that suffice? That's all I want from you. But I said, pointing to Julian, had better keep away from Jane, or there will be trouble. I felt a lot better for getting that off my chest, and more importantly, I had persuaded her to make the concession I craved. Things moved on. My relationship with Sally had blossomed. We were now openly living together in my flat. Brian still had his own room, but now it was upstairs. I came to love him just as much as I loved his mother. We did all the things families do together until one day he floored me by asking, why didn't you marry my mother so that you could really be my daddy? His innocent question caused me to stop and take stock. I realized that he was right. I loved his mother. I loved having him around and teaching him how to do his homework. There was no good reason not to get married. I reflected that I had been pretty selfish, sharing my life and bed with Sally. It was a pretty one-sided partnership, and she had never once dropped any hints that she wanted to formalize our relationship. I took her out for dinner one evening shortly afterwards, and when dinner was over, we went for a drive to the coast. I parked on the clifftop, and we watched the sunset over the sea. I waited until it was almost gone and drew the little box out of my pocket. Taking her hand, I asked, "Sally, I love you more than I can put into words. Please, will you marry me?" She looked me straight in the eyes, and I could see the tears welling up in hers as she pulled me close and whispered, "Yes. Oh God, yes." She opened the box, withdrew the ring from its little holster, and asked me to put it on her finger. I slipped it on, and she kept lifting her hand to watch as the fading sun glinted off its many facets. We went straight home and celebrated by spending most of the night together. We announced the news to all the drivers the next day, and they were pleased for us. I phoned Jane, and she was surprised that I had found someone else. She asked if she could come and meet Sally, and I of course said yes. She brought Alistair with her, and I gathered from the conversation that Sally had briefed him on why I had not been to see them. Things were awkward at first, but gradually he came around. The next few weeks were busy. We both wanted a quiet wedding, and arrangements were made for a local registry office wedding. Apart from Brian, only Jane and Alistair attended. The service was short, and we celebrated with a couple of drinks and a nice meal. A few weeks later, the issue hit Allison hard. A national tabloid newspaper had gotten hold of some pictures from one of their parties and wrote an alleged eyewitness account of the incident. Since they had photographs and everything, Allison could not really deny it. According to the article, they had been subject to a typical newspaper sting. They had invited a couple to one of their parties after they had approached Julian and expressed an interest in the swinging lifestyle. Unfortunately, they turned out to be reporters, and as Julian had charged them a couple of £100 for access, serious questions were being asked about whether they were operating a brothel. Allison phoned and asked me if I could take Jane and Alistair for a few weeks until the fuss had died down. They were being besieged by reporters and TV crews vying for an interview, and she felt that it wasn't fair on our kids to be exposed to the media circus. We were more than willing, even if it meant some rearrangements in our household. I gave the basement flat to Jane. She was now almost 18 and needed her own space. Alistair shared a room with Brian, and they seemed to get along okay. The story continued to make front-page news, and Allison and Julian's employers decided to cut their losses and terminate the series they had been filming. After a while, the publicity died down, and Allison asked Jane and Alistair to come back home. They both refused outright, but they did visit every week. Neither of them wanted to lose contact with their mother. A few weeks later, Jane returned from visiting her mother in tears. Sally pushed me out of the room and told me she would talk to Jane alone. She said, "Sometimes a woman-to-woman talk is what's needed." She was right, and once more, I thanked God for giving me such an understanding and loving wife. After about an hour, Sally came out and related what had caused Jane's distress. Apparently, when Jane turned up at home hoping to see her mother, it was not a scheduled visit. Usually, she phoned ahead first to make sure that Allison was at home. This time, she was in the area, so she just popped in on the off chance that she would be home. The front door was being guarded by a large man who refused to let her enter. She made a fuss, and Julian appeared, asking what all the commotion was about. When he saw Jane, he smiled and invited her to join them, saying, "Come on and see how your mother and I make our living now that your father has messed up our careers." She entered the lounge to see her mother, unclothed, with two men at the same time. There was not a lot of space, as there were film cameras dotted about recording the action. She tried to back out of the room, but Julian was standing right behind her, blocking her exit. "We have started making these adult movies in response to public demand, and your mother is in high demand right now," he said, grinning. "You see, the public is tired of these glossy, contrived videos. They want realistic films that look as though they are shot by amateurs, depicting real-life married couples engaging in intimate activities. Your mother certainly fits the bill on all counts. This movie is supposed to be from one of our parties. That was before your father tipped off the press and ruined our lives." Jane tried to push past him, but he grabbed hold of her and forced her to watch her mother in action. The two men changed position, and another woman joined them. Jane tried once more to escape from Julian's grasp, but he restrained her, whispering that he could arrange for her to join in and help her mother out. At that, she pressed down on his shin and foot, and he released her, howling in pain. June took her opportunity to escape and came straight home to us. I was furious and stormed out of the house, driving to my ex's home to confront Julian and Allison. Lucky for me, they must have finished for the day, as it was only Julian who answered the door. I brushed past him and entered the lounge. It was tidy and clean. There was no evidence to support Jane's claim about what had taken place there earlier. Julian stood at the door, grinning like a cat that had just gotten the cream. He must have been expecting my arrival and had cleaned up all traces of the inappropriate activities witnessed by Jane. "Can I help you?" he asked, still grinning. "Do you want to borrow a movie or something?" Then Allison joined us. She was fully clothed and acted as though nothing was amiss. I told her what Jane had said she had witnessed, and Allison denied it. When I told her that Julian had suggested to Jane that she might want to help her mother out and participate herself, I saw a flicker of anger cross her face before she recovered her composure and said, "I'm sure that Jane was mistaken. Nothing has taken place here today. I can assure you of that. Jane must be making this up as a way of seeking your attention." This was futile. I thought. Clearly Allison was protecting her husband. As I left, I turned to Julian and said, "If you ever touch my daughter again, I will make your legs very painful and ensure you are never without discomfort for the rest of your life. For your information, I never talked to the press about you and Allison's lifestyle. If I had, there would have been much more scandalous details than what they reported." Turning to Allison, I told her, "I doubt if either Jane or Alistair will want to talk to you anymore. But if they do, it will not happen here or in your husband's presence. Do you understand?" She nodded, and for a second, I thought I saw a little remorse in her expression. The realization that she had called her daughter a liar and had probably alienated her forever might have penetrated her thoughts. I was right. Both Jane and Alistair wanted nothing more to do with their mother. Life went on, and our family business prospered. 3 years had gone by, and I had won some new contracts. The courier side of the business was expanding. Jane entered the business, starting as a courier driver to learn the ropes from the bottom up. I pushed her into business development, and soon we had more business than we could comfortably handle. The business was attracting interest from national players, and we sold out. One of the conditions was that Jane had to transfer with the business, or the deal would be off. She was more than happy to do so, as she had met a man she strongly fancied. We expect to hear wedding bells soon. Alistair is still at university, studying engineering and playing rugby. As for Sally and me, well, we are settled into a comfortable lifestyle and thinking of selling up and moving abroad. The only reason we haven't already done so is Brian. He still has a few years of schooling left, and we are delaying any decision until he decides what he wants. I think he wants to be a fast jet pilot and has joined the university air squadron. It's early days yet, and he has a lot of hurdles to overcome to achieve his ambition. Things did not go so well for Allison. Julian had pissed her off and left her, but not before clearing out the bank accounts of everything he could get his hands on. Suddenly, Allison was broke. Her movies had made some quick money, but Julian had diverted that into his own pockets. She came to me asking for a loan, but I refused. She lost the house as she couldn't afford the mortgage payments. Julian had remortgaged it heavily before he left her. The last I heard was that she was a hostess at some nightclub in London. As retribution goes, it was minimal, but I am happy with the way things had turned out. Thanks to everyone who took the time to listen to today's stories. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing if you haven't already. Feel free to share your thoughts on the events in the comments below. Take care.